some of the conferences, I've seen some of this. This is all open source. Brian used the term I like, blind test. And there is a lot to be said for that, especially if you start comparing different brands. People get pretty puckered about that. And then especially if you get pretty far off I've spent some money at a lawyer last year convincing one of my customers that it was okay for me to do my own experiments, even though I talked about it with him. So I work harder now that we're open source unless I have an agreement between you and any of us. This was a plot I had in. Now you guys need to understand I own 0 acres other than the 3 acres my house is on, and my wife would kick me out if I tried putting corn in it. So I just go out, run around and beg, borrow, and steal ground. Generally, all my best data and my best images comes from really good corn ground farmed professionally by usually large scale operators. And I put Lauren in that category also. He can get good yield. He's got enough acres. He's got the right equipment and all that. But then I go dink around with my little plot stuff, and I think it was Jason that alluded to the idea that this is a lot of damn work when you start doing this stuff. So this particular field was awful. There's a grade change. The north half of the field was a borrow pile for a highway construction that never got, I think it's just all, I don't think there was ever any topsoil put back on. It's just awful. And then the lower half is a little better. And I had, in this field, I had basically 4, I called them replications, but it was only the first 4 rows in each of these major blocks that was the same variety. And then after that, each rep had a completely different variety. So the statistician types kind of roll their eyes at that and say, well, it don't count. And I only had that 4 rows replicated in the trial all 4 times at the insistence of my good friend Jack Boyer, who's done a lot of these things, and he's an old John Deere heavy quality, heavy statistics guy. And so he caused me to do that, and it was the best thing I did, one of the best things I did. But I had 30-inch, 60-inch single, 60-inch twin, 90-inch twin, and then since it's just us girls, I can say I played with some other things like planting corn in hills within some of these wider row configurations and different amounts of seed in each hill. So don't ask me to go down that rabbit hole in this conversation, but just you'll see some of that nomenclature referred to. The yield was highly variable, planted or harvested 1 row at a time with my little and I got a little scale that I built into my combine tank, so I can actually do good data on this 60-foot plot down here. I better watch out. It's 11 o'clock. Are you guys okay for a little while longer? Yeah, I guess you'll leave if you're not. Okay, so and the bottom line is, depending on variety, there was a very large spread from the worst to the best. The reason the blue bar here is the same variety throughout the plot, but there's just a lot of difference in the spread. And it was kind of like, the more I looked at this, the more I got convinced that the variety matters. And you can see down here on the bottom, I had a number of different variations going on. So plus the soil variability trumped everything else. So just really disgusting. So this is what I intend to do next year. That slide got out of place. I had a sit down, reviewed the data with a seed breeder from a major seed company. We're gonna come out of the closet here one of these days, but for right now, I'm just gonna say this was the corporate perspective, and I was running fairly high populations, much higher than I should have. I was like at I think maybe 28,000 on everything, and this field probably didn't deserve that. But higher population drives more plant to plant variability. I have certainly experienced that. I would add in that higher populations in when you have closer plant to plant spacing in the row, it gets ever more important to do a really good job of planting. So non-uniform emergence is always a problem, but it's a death knell if you start getting stuff really close together. This company rep didn't particularly care to get second ears. They see that as a waste of resources. I would agree. I rarely have good second ears. I do have some, but rarely. And then if you were really going to cover the waterfront, they'd like to see 30-inch twin rows, kind of the old Harry Stein planters. I don't have a lot of energy for that, but that's the golden rule. So, and then in this case, the field variability was a bigger deal than the variety, and that's just a problem me having to beg, borrow, and steal ground. And the recommendations were you can do plots on challenging ground. So who is it? One of you confessed to being south of a certain highway in Illinois. I think that's maybe Jason. No, that's not Jason. That's I don't know. No matter. I'll get it all figured out eventually. But having not great soil is not a deterrent to having a plot. I was surprised to hear that. What is important is uniform soil in the plot. You all know that from your own yield maps and all that. So what this seed rep said is, given a choice of high yield or uniform soil, I'll put the plot in the uniform soil any day. If it's 180 bushel corn and it's a consistent plot, that's okay. We can learn some things. I was and then lower ground tends to get more challenged based on weather and all that. What I heard that I hadn't ever heard from anybody but my little combine, and it's a 40-year-old John Deere 6620 with I got 4 and 6 row heads. I got a 4-row row crop head, and I got a platform for. So I got a shed full of that stuff. But the game changer for that seed company was that by having a pretty accurate scale in the tank really made that a useful plot machine for the kind of work I do. And now if you're a John Deere combine fanatic, you know that vertical auger has terrible resolution on unloading. So I could never get very good data unless that's why I liked quarter-mile long rows, because the variability of the unloading system kind of got offset at that point. But then what the rep said is if they had $1 million, and then that's where my ears perked up, they would do replicated trials that had 4 reps, 8 to 10 varieties, that was in 30-inch, 30-inch twin, 60, 60-inch twin, 90, and 90-inch twin rows. Now, I have to honor what Zach said here. I think his idea on 72-inch is probably spot on. He probably put some dots on a graph and drew a line between them and says, this is where I want to be. My prejudice on that was the aforementioned being able to get a real utility tractor down between the rows, and also to not ask people to change their harvesting equipment. And the nice thing about twin rows is you can harvest it with a standard corn head, and it really works pretty good unless the corn's down, and then nothing works very well. Also, I was surprised that the seed rep was happy with a 100-foot row. The rep thought that 50 foot is too short. There's too much variability associated with start and stop. And my experience talking to growers is if it's not a quarter-mile long row with weigh wagon data, not yield monitor, but weigh wagon data, it's not real credible. But when you get into the agronomy things, 100 feet is nice because you got more plants there. You got you've negated or downscaled the start stop thing a little bit more, and also you stay more likely to stay within a given soil type. And And then the other thing that we really haven't talked about, and we won't today, is the cover crop challenges. So I put together a plan that reflected that $1 million plan. I thought, okay, well, I'll take your $1 million. I can do that. And I put together a plan. I'll share that if we get time. And it's pretty cool, but it is an enormous undertaking. So I said, well, okay, we gotta do something simple here. So I went back and I've got this aforementioned poor ground. And then we are getting access, me and a couple of friends are getting access to some really good ground where we're going to do a really simple test, but it's going to be a test in front of the world on a very large grower's property. So the priority I said is I always want to have a baseline in there. I just can't operate without a 30-inch baseline, and that helps me rationalize the obscene amount of money I put into my corn planter. And then the other one is 60-inch single. I agree that at the gut level, and I think I've got some. I know I've had some people that have told me, in addition to today, that 60-inch twins should just automatically do better than 60-inch singles. On the other hand, I get better cover crop response, and I've got a little bit of data on that with 60-inch singles than I do 60-inch twins. And that's where Zach's 72-inch twins might do a better job in his cover crop, which he wants to graze, I think. And so that gets to be a factor. 4 replications is kind of the minimum across the field with in variable soil. And I've put together a plan that I can get 8 varieties in that. So I'm going to take that same field, roughly these 4 blocks, slightly tweaked. And this has kind of been a weed patch. In 2021, I had rows going this way. We put in a bunch of cover crop. We got 0 corn off of it because it was dry. We didn't bother to drive the combine into it. It's like, okay. And there is enormous animal pressure with this because it's surrounded by green space, which makes it also interesting. So what I'm going to have, 4 replications, 8 varieties, 2 different row widths. So the first 32 rows in each of these blocks is going to be just 30-inch corn. And so that way, I got 30-inch next to 30-inch. I don't waste so much time with buffers that have goofy spacings between them. And then I'll flip to 60-inch, and I'll have 8 varieties, 8 varieties that have 4 60-inch rows, equivalent to 8 30s, 4 60-inch rows of each variety. So that gives me another 32 rows. So I got 950 feet in this direction. I will probably put an alley down through the center because there's a very significant grade change, and it'll make it easier for keeping track. So these aren't going to be perfect squares. They're going to be a little bit trapezoidal, but I use the GPS on my combine to record length, and that works just fine. So this is kind of what the block's going to look like. The imagery in the background is from last year, obviously. Questions or comments on that? Or is my internet so bad that nobody's listening?
But Bob,
Yes.
what about the border impact on your control, on your baseline?
Okay.
How much border do you have?
So the assumption here, this is the 30-inch portion of the plot, Leroy. Good question. You sound like a researcher. I expect that the row 2 and row 3 will be the good data rows here. I will pick this plot 1 row at a time, and I have good detailed paper documentation of what I got out of each row. If these are adjacent 30-inch rows and there's not a big difference in varieties, you could argue that maybe this is still interesting data, but for sure the good data is only row 2 and 3 6 and 7, 10 and 11. So I won't have any border things going on here in the 30 inch. And I think I can argue that if I had my druthers, Leroy, I'd have 8 rows of 30, but I just ran out of space.
Right, I understand. Now, I see no problem with having no border in between the varieties. I was just thinking about between the 30s and the 60s.
Yep. So now if I go to the 60s, I'll have 4 rows. Again, the gold standard will be the 2 in the center. But again, we've got a uniform spacing. We will have data for this. And that's how I spend my winters, is looking at little nuances like that. But then for each of the 8 varieties, I should have 2 replications within the big replication of that data. And remember, I've split the field in north half versus south half. So, but this will be very low yielding unless my cover crop is starting to work and all of that. But I'll actually have data for the south half and data for the north half. And this will be in a pretty low yielding environment, but I will have data. So what's missing here is data in really good soil. And any other questions or comments on that?
Yeah, so what I do is nothing near as intense, but I do leave the border rows when I do the side by sides. I leave them stand and I'm weighing the inner rows side by side. If you get my gist there.
Yep. And that is the right thing to do. That is the right thing to do. Yep, good for you. Yeah, I've kind of made one of my signature deals the single row harvest, and that just gets really interesting. So I'm going to try to make this very visible to the public. This is right off of a main highway. If I'm sure at least a couple of you are going to go buy a new John Deere tractor this year. If you come to the factory for a gold key experience for your $300,000 or $400,000 you're going to spend, this is about 2 miles from the factory, on a main drag highway going into town. So I'm gonna and I've got like a 60-foot headland, so I can turn around my combine and get access to wagons and all of that. So I'm kind of playing with pollinators and trying to put a bunch of radishes and stuff here on the north side where the soil's really hard. But I'm going to try to have a path here that anybody, when they happen to get in the area, they can just drive in and drive their pickup down and around. If things go well and I've got some markings and it's not too embarrassing of a plot, I might even put some signage up or something like that. This will be Pioneer seed. It is being provided. I take about a quarter of a bag for each of these reps. I think maybe it's a half a bag. So that's what I'm going to do there. I'm going to show you next the dream, the $1 million plot. So I said, well, and I took. Go ahead, Jason.
Are you interseeding covers in those wide rows on that plot?
Yes, everything will be interseeded with a mix, not yet determined, but I'm going to try to keep it consistent. In spite of my instinct to want to experiment, I'm going to have a consistent cover crop, and it's going to be heavily biased toward weed prevention and growing nitrogen for a future year. That'll be and then soil health after that. That'll kind of be the priority list on Keith Burns' green cover cover crop selection process. And I will.
Are you doing the 30s?
I'm going to interseed those also. I will interseed them with my little drill that I think you guys have seen. Dawn dual seed units. When the corn is about V2 or V3, maybe V4. my seed company person wants the cover crop to be far away from the corn rows and planted fairly late. What the seed company rep would really like is, and I'm going to deliver, is at least 10 and maybe 15 inches from the corn row and seeded at least V2 or maybe V3 or V4. So this has now become a—
Hey, Bob, a general question.
Sure.
I see a lot of trees around the edges. What's your experience with deer damage? That's my biggest issue I think I'm gonna have. It's in a field that I can graze, but there's woods on two sides of it like that.
It's going to be awful. I had a freaking beaver drop a tree into my plot because he was damming up a waterway next to it. I've had deer. I ran over a dead deer in the plot. I don't think it died from anything I put there, but and yeah, it's a freaking, and that's part of the problem. My experience is the wide rows don't seem to get hurt as bad with deer damage as strip intercropping does. And the strip intercropping, Junior may want to speak to this, but the deer, they're lazy. They go out, walk through the soybeans, and then eat everything off the edge rows and the corn and ignore everything else. Here, there's so many rows. Every row is an open row. If one thing I would suggest, Brian, is you might consider a fairly high population 30-inch row around the plot, and maybe on if you had like planter passes, make the first planter pass on the outside a wide row plot, so the lazy deer can go in there and graze their little heart outs on the wide rows, make their nest for sleeping at night in the cornfield in the cover crop. And then the higher population 30-inch rows will kind of serve as a fence to keep them out of your plot.
Yep. Okay.
That's being
Sounds
a little
good.
maybe, but yeah. Anybody else? Jump in, please. Love the conversation.
I had something to add there, Brian. When I interseeded some of my 30-inch open pollinated last year, I used the outside as a had some taller cover crops, but where my cover crops didn't come up, they used that as a channel and then had a party on the inside there. So that was something we tried. I don't know, like a biofence almost. That it was really hard to scout where that stuff was, and I noticed they didn't do as much damage there. But I mean, it almost acted as a fence, if you will.
Yeah. And I bounced the idea off of Lauren last year, and he had experience that was useful. I says, well, maybe we ought to put a cover crop in that the deer love so they don't bother the corn. And he says, well, they did that in some other plots, and what they got was deer from 5 miles away got the message on where the good stuff was, and it just made matters worse. Okay.
Hey, Bob, this is Zach.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Bob?
Yep. Go ahead.
What's the possibility of you getting a site, that doesn't have some of these limitations, just to, have something that's more realistic of, good Iowa ground rather than the stuff that you're kind of being pigeonholed into working with?
I am going to have some really good ground this year, and it's with a new grower that's in the best data I have is he got 23,000 acres of corn, and just yesterday I got a pin dropped into it, but it's going to be a 1/4 mile long rows of 60-inch and versus 30-inch singles, Pioneer seed. And we're going to try to find the best Pioneer seed that I can get a consensus view on what should do well in 60-inch singles, north-south rows, 6 replications, and 8-row 30, and I think 8-row 60-inch. So it's going to be the exact opposite of what I just shared with you, but it's focused on one variable, and that is 60-inch versus 30-inch, but it's in good ground. It's kind of put up or shut up time for old Bob on 60-inch rows with Pioneer seed.
Good.
Is
I was-
he changing the population?
No, it'll be one population, one field population for everything. And I hate that because the first big money I spent on my planter was freaking electric drives that I can change the population from the cab with a button push. But the problem with population is that it becomes a rabbit hole that chews up so much space in the plot and creates so much complexity that I can't look at any other variables. And it's like everybody and their brother's done. I hope all of you guys, I don't mean that, I don't say that in a demeaning manner. It's easy to do a population trial. I hope you guys that are doing playing with 60-inch rows do some population trials, because I expect at least some of you probably have electric drives or hydraulic drives. It's when it's easy to do, that's a good time to do it. And if you've got a few more acres that you're doing, then that is certainly worth looking at. That's a long answer to a short question.
So what is he doing for his 30-inch population? Do you know?
In the plot I just referred to? Yeah, and I will plant.
Right, yeah.
I will plant the 30-inch with my planter, and my row units just slid over. Because one of my anal engineering dogmatic things is I want to keep the number of variables to an absolute minimum. We're thinking we'll be in the 34, 35,000.
So then your single inch 60 will be like 30 or 65 to 70,000.
Yep. And that doesn't bother me a bit. And this is he does a little bit of vertical tillage. It's kind of a conservation field. It did not, I don't know whether it had cover crop in it this year or not. I'm pretty sure it was beans last year. And we're going to try to try really hard to have the variety be the same as what he is planting adjacent to the plot. So one of the things I do is I individually pick one of his planter passes just to give him some feedback on the variability in his own planting system. But I will be planting everything in the plot, both the 30s and 60s.
And he's looking for.
Go ahead.
But he's looking for the 60-inch to outperform the 30s.
I am. He's just tolerating me. He's just a good guy. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Well, I think it's going to be hard for you to do when in your 60-inch single rows the plants are 1.5 inches apart. I mean, it's just not. It just doesn't make sense. Nobody in practice in large scale is going to do that.
It works. We've done it several times.
Really?
Yeah, Jason, I don't, and I'm gonna sound defensive here, but one of my things is to try to make this a baby step for a current commercial corn grower. And as Zach will testify, going from singles to twin rows is not a baby step.
No, it's not.
So I want people, and if that may impact to some extent the variety selection. For sure, it demands you do a better job of planting, which I'm not particularly good at, as Lauren would be happy to testify. But yeah, I'm trying to make it for it to be a system. I think the rows need to be twin rows, and frankly, I think they need to be wider than 60 inches. And so Zach may have the answer there. And last year at this time, I thought the answer was 90-inch twin rows with 4 plant hills. And I planted a bunch of it. And it didn't do real well, partly because my hill system wasn't working as good as it should have. So that's the goofy world I live in, but I can live in that world because I don't have to get corn off the field to pay the rent. But the grower is really just tolerating us. I only met him. I never, he's Zach, you'll like this. He's over by Parkersburg, a little closer to you, if you will. Very, very open with, he doesn't really even care what seed brand it is. He's just saying, yeah, guys, you got an idea. You want to try that? Go ahead. It's a gift from God.
So as a consensus in this group, what would you guys like to see in a plot? 30s versus single 60s, or 30s versus twin 60s, or both?
30s versus twin 60s.
I like the idea of both. I'm a little bit interested in the inner row rolling, where I think the single row 60s would work better.
Right.
And then, yeah, Lauren.
Lauren likes singles because he has better access to the plant. He can get closer with his rollers.
Well, that's the key deciding factor. If you're going twin rows, you're pretty much ruling out organics.
So, and then what about population? Same population, half the population?
We've always maintained field average. I mean, we've had plots all the way. What did we end up? 95 actual. I mean, I talk. That's probably the biggest thing, you guys. If you're going to get something, you should have universal language, I guess. I mean, everybody in the world talks field average, but when you start talking row average, that screws people up.
Right.
And that was, but that's also some of the most educational stuff you can do. I mean, me and Bob had a miscommunication that time, and we ended up with that 95,000 actual field average, and that's been pretty eye-opening. Just when the plants will adapt, I guess that's what I keep going back to. And you can take a broad-leaf plant and make it a narrow-leaf plant just by squeezing it together. The closer the plant population and stuff like that. So it's all going to come back to doing testing on your own farm, as it's been said here many times, because the seed company data is going to be relevant to what you're doing. And that's also what I see the biggest problem is, the varieties change that. If you're running the newest varieties, I think you're out on a limb. So you're almost stuck to the older varieties, and that's probably not a bad thing. And that, to me, that's probably what sets us different on a lot of the data that we've done on our farm, is we've never pushed the latest, greatest hybrids anymore. So your older hybrids can handle this better. It goes back to what we said about the open pollinated corn, and that's part of why I think the open pollinated corn lends itself well, because it's the older genetics.
So the stuff that you're trying from 60 to 95,000, was that open pollinated?
No, that was commercial corn yet. Like I said, on that whole plot that time, it was all within 2 to 3 bushel an acre, from 35,000 all the way up to 95,000. So in the end, the break even was 35. The 35 had by far better because he had less seed cost.
That's 35,000 in 60 inch.
35,000 field average.
Yeah.
So yeah,
okay.
them plants, they're squeezed together pretty tight, but. But biggest thing, is your planner prepared to do it? That's the thing I would stress to people, because if you're not going to slow the planter down and all that, every little thing you do is going to show up. Everything, you know, and Bob kind of showed that on that one chart there. Every little hiccup is amplified. That's probably where I would say the twin row is probably better for most people, is because you're running a 30-inch planter. It's just their space different.
Yeah, let me jump in there. There is a thing called a poor man's twin row, where you just use your GPS if you have it or not, and offset yourself, you know, between 6 and 10 inches. I think that's what Zach did last year. The first year I did twin rows, and I had awesomely high corn yield, which is why I went out and bought a bunch of twin row units. But you got to be very careful there, especially with row cleaners and the like, or you'll be pushing stalks and residue back on top of the row. People have highly mixed results with trying to do the two, what I would call a poor man's or a 2-pass twin row. But if you're really curious and you know, and you're ahead of the game for the season and you want to do a little experiment, that's one that's really easy to do with the equipment that you have in hand. But to acknowledge the communication problem that I had, and you can have it with yourself too if you're doodling with a pencil on the back of a seed corn bag what population you want to set. But when I talked about population, I talked about the button I pushed on my monitor for what I wanted the meter to run for that particular row in a single 60-inch rows. So I just double it. Okay. So I just thought, yeah, Lauren, set it to that. Well, Lauren, with the same precision planting system on his planter, when he went to 60-inch rows, he changed the row setting in the planter settings to 60-inch rows. And then I told him to put in 60,000. Or is that the way? Well, I told him to put in 30 or 35, whatever.
Well,
anyhow, it ended up we doubled.
Yeah, the way I run mine when I'm doing wide row corn is I just shut rows off, and then the monitor automatically adjusts the population. So, you know, if I'm planting a field 35,000, you just shut off odd rows or even rows, and it automatically adjusts the meters accordingly.
It does? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I tried to tell you that a few times.
Well, it's been about 5 years. You haven't told me more than 4 or 5 times. So I'm not sure I.
Yeah, well, I mean,
because
that's why I could never figure out why you spend so much time calculating. I mean, all you got to do is have the plant population set, and then if you shut off the rows, it you know, you can go right from 30 to 60-inch rows, and it'll still be 35,000 field average. It's just your plants will be squeezed together, you know, half again as much on the wider rows than the narrow rows.
My high suggestion would be dig up some seed, you guys.
Well,
all right.
Dig up seed, but slow your plant. You know, if you're running the planter population that high, even on electric drive, you're going to be down to 2 miles an hour to get a nice stand. Because otherwise, you'll have them barren plants and all that stuff. And like I said, you know, when I hear people talk about it, when they start saying you can't match yields, chances are you start asking them what they did on their planter, and usually it's something, you know, they didn't pay attention to them little details on the planter. And it amplifies fast. And, you know, your closing is probably the biggest thing I'd see with a lot of the different row units.
Yeah. Yep. And Junior, I just saw your chat. Yes, electric drives are a godsend. I have spent a friggin' fortune on my planter. But one of the first things I bought and one of the best choices was the electric drive. And then right behind that is the iPad that is mapping what the planter is doing as you're planting. And that speaks to Lauren's statement that says you really need to know. I can't imagine doing a lot of this stuff without having the information that precision. I think Deere does now, I'm not sure. But without having that information on the screen in front of me, just in case I've screwed something up in my assumptions. So, okay, I'm gonna move ahead here. This is absolutely wonderful.
Well, one last thing on that, Bob. I mean, when you're talking shifting your population and that, it's on the precision monitor, you can have up to 4 different rates
Right.
on the toolbar. And I mean, we did a lot of that. That was back when we first got the electric drive. We'd put the outside row 45, the second row 40, if I remember right, and then 37.5, and then still variable rate on the inside of the planter.
Yeah.
What was that? Probably 2013, 14, we were doing that stuff.
Yeah. Junior, I can't imagine doing strip intercropping without an electric drive planter. So you can tell your wife, Bob says it's okay to buy some meters.